I'm going to be talking to economist Dave Sawyer, who has co-authored a report on carbon pricing in Canada for the Canadian government and the Canadian Institute on Climate Choices. So welcome to the interview, Dave.
Markham, thanks for having me.
Look, why don't we start with an overview of your study, please?
Okay, so Climate Choices was asked by the federal government to do an independent review of carbon pricing systems in the country. The request flows out of the Pan-Canadian framework, and the scuttlebutt at the time and why this independent review was included was that BC wanted to, they have a very stringent policy and they wanted reviews to happen, independent reviews to happen to take a closer look at how the systems are performing. So Climate Choices was asked to come in and do the review, and we were basically reporting to all the provinces and territories. So when we produced our information and we sort of engaged the provinces and territories and the federal government on their programs, we did it on equal basis and interacted with everybody as it were at the same time. And the result is sort of a fairly heavy document that looks at carbon pricing coast to coast, in 2020 as implemented in all 13 provinces and territories.
Now, Dave, my take on this, or one take anyway, is that in a decentralized federation like Canada, I mean, the central government, the national government is basically said, look, we expect the provinces to implement carbon pricing regimes. Here's the backstop if you don't do that, and we'll implement it if you don't. But basically, you can design a made in BC or a made in Quebec or made in Ontario program. But then that means you get everybody's doing, what different governments take different approaches. And is that not, so is inconsistency and, regional variation just not baked into the cake?
Well, so some regional variation is okay as long as it doesn't impact effectiveness or cost effectiveness. And that's really what we were focused on. So the review really was, okay, what are the differences in design choices that have been made that jeopardize long-term effectiveness? Canada's going deeper on emission reductions. We're driving net zero. We need to find cost-effective emission reductions everywhere. And we probably need to do it fairly because we're a federation and we don't want to have pollution havens emerging where one jurisdiction is a light touch and one's a heavy touch and it impacts investment patterns. So regional variation is okay, but of course, there are some choices that jeopardize long-term effectiveness.
Well, let's talk about regional differences in sources of emissions covered by carbon pricing and which ones are exempt.
Yeah, so when you think about effectiveness, you think about two things. One, coverage, so what emissions are we covering? And two, stringency, so how much are we asking, or what's the value of emission reduction? So the first piece of the pie we looked at was coverage. So what emissions are being covered by carbon pricing in Canada? And how does that vary across jurisdictions? And of course, we found a whole bunch of exemptions that are very unique to some provinces, and they're put in place to protect some emitters worried about income impacts. And then we also found a lot of consistency across jurisdictions. So to give you an idea, sort of right now, the common set of coverage is about 78% of our total emission inventory, which is quite high. And we figure you could probably add another 5 or 10%, 5 or 8% on top of that to expand coverage. So we're actually doing a really good job on coverage.
Okay, yeah. Excellent. What about misalignment among regions on the price applied to both consumer and industrial emissions?
Right, yeah. So where it goes a little sideways is that there's a lot of, we're not seeing the same price in all emissions. So coverage is pretty good. There's some exemptions in there. They could be cleaned up. Industrial process emissions are very unequally covered. They could be cleaned up, but not major risks. Some of the larger risks we found were around point of sale rebates. So basically a rebate that is tied to fuel use or your emissions directly. So you're standing at the pump and the federal or the provincial government has reduced the excise tax on your gasoline to offset the carbon price, explicitly done so. So instead of 6 cents a liter in some provinces, in the East Coast in particular, you have a price signal of 2 cents a liter. And we're doing that for income reasons. So we're worried again about impacts, household impacts. But we would argue, well, let's remove those point of sale rebates and maintain the price signal and deal with your income concerns like the federal government does, which is basically recycling back the money to your tax return, or British Columbia reduces your corporate tax rate.
And now you're the economist, but I've had my understanding is that carbon prices work because consumers treat their income and their expenses differently. So you want the expenses to send the right signal, where then you send the money back to them as a rebate, and they treat those two differently, and that's essentially the mechanism that makes it work.
Yeah, exactly. So in the one with the pump in your hand, you see the carbon price and you think about your fuel choices and you think about your vehicle choices, and your wallet, you get the money back in your wallet at a later date, untied to your consumption of fuel and your emissions. Yeah, so that's the way we prefer to see it.
The third one is discrepancy in industrial emissions. And this is very interesting to me because the oil and gas industry, centered in Alberta, but also in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Newfoundland, a little bit in BC, makes up 26% of all of the Canadian emissions, and the oil sands by itself makes up 11%. So this is a huge issue, and I understand that based on output-based allocations baked into the carbon pricing systems, that they get discounts of up to 80 to 90% on those emissions, and that seems to be, as your report said, maybe creates risk to long-term carbon objectives.
Yeah, right. So why? So first of all, backing up, 40% of our national emissions are under large emitter programs. That's a massive number. So of our total emissions in Canada, 40% are under these large emitter programs. The large emitter programs are designed to protect competitiveness. So they give you basically a sort of break on your balance sheet. So how do they work? And you have to think about marginal and average costs. So we'll get a little economic-y here. But your marginal cost, or the carbon price, sort of drives your short-term decision-making and some of your long-term decision-making around fuel choices, energy efficiency. And so that's good. The large emitter programs do that in that any emission reduction is saleable. You can generate credits, you can bank them. So you're thinking about that marginal price, but the average cost is your balance sheet. And what happens here is we give you 90% or 95% of your emissions for free. And so the average cost is $5. We figured in the country, the average large emitter average cost is $5 versus a $30 carbon price. And that impact on the low impact on the balance sheet does not drive the transformation around your industrial process and new investment that we need to the long-term signal. So we need marginal price, and then we need this stronger average cost that drives investment decision-making. And what we found is that these average costs are really low, and it's a really weak transition signal. Yeah.
Let me get back to the oil sands for a minute, because this is of the large emitters, this industry is one I know well. And so the argument is that you don't want to tax the carbon price to be too high, because otherwise those oil companies might migrate to somewhere else where there's no carbon pricing at all. Problem is the oil sands can't move.
Yeah, they can't move.
They can't move, and not only that, but they don't, like conventional oil is produced in Canada does compete with other grades of oil from the United States and elsewhere. The oil sands doesn't. Heavy crude has there's a 10 million barrel a day market. Canada's the big producer. Much of that oil is shipped by the oil companies themselves, like Suncor and Cenovus, and shipped to their own refineries down in the US. So they are their own customer. And if there was an industry that should not get a big discount, it would seem to me that would be one. Is that an example of the kind of discrepancies we're talking about?
Well, so I mean, Alberta and the federal government, for their opt-in program, the opt-in program is basically if you're not a large emitter, but you compete against a large emitter, you can get this special treatment. So basically the tests there are about profitability and sales impact. So your compliance costs, so that average cost as like what's your total cost? So that $5 you roll up to total emissions. what's your average cost and how does that compare to like on a balance sheet basis? What's your revenue? What's the ratio of costs over revenue? Is it greater than 1 or 2%? So there are these tests in place. And what we find when we apply these tests is that these costs are really, really low as a share of total revenue or total profits, like fractions of a percent kind of thing. So is there space to basically increase these average costs? It seems yes. And then the other piece is that the world has moved really fast on carbon pricing, and these programs are in place to keep costs aligned and not allow sort of leakage to occur, meaning that you're unfairly competing with somebody else, so you lose market share and emissions rise somewhere else. And what we find is that when we look at Canada's trade data, a significant share of our exports are going to jurisdictions with carbon pricing, including the US. 30% of Canada's exports go to US jurisdictions with carbon pricing. Washington State, the RGGI states, and California, 30%. So the question really is, can we play with those average costs, not hammer the business, and recognize the markets they're playing in terms of carbon pricing and misaligned costs?
Well, Dave, final question then. Can I assume then that the government's intent here is to say, okay, we put this in place. We now have the system more or less functioning the way we had hoped, but it needs some fine tuning. And based on this analysis and the data that we found, now we can go in and fine tune and, those industries that are maybe not paying as much as they should, that can be bumped up and so on. Is that a fair takeaway from this conversation?
Yeah, I think we need to do regular stock taking on our policies, especially these big, large policies that people are a little neurotic about, right? Worried about job killing carbon taxes and costs on business and competitiveness. So this review we did, along with a number of other reviews that are being done by the federal governments and the provinces, are really these important accountability exercises to take a look at the policy and to basically look for opportunities to strengthen them. I mean, one observation is that in the last 5 years, we've doubled the coverage of carbon pricing from about 38% to 80%. So we've been really expedient in moving this forward, and it's not a surprise that we found some risks to effectiveness. And now, opportunity to start cleaning it up and frankly, working a little tighter together across provinces and the feds so that we don't have these misaligned costs, for example.
Dave, thank you very much for these insights. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.